are talking about urban gardening, but it was a big effort with rural areas too. 4-H is a big program in rural areas for farm kids to get to show their livestock, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there was a big program sponsored by Sears nationwide where they found young women garden leaders that were working in their 4-H groups to lead people into developing victory gardens and establishing that. And this was an event that happened in 1943 where those young ladies were all pulled together from across the nation and rewarded for their efforts. I really love their little hats, their little 4-H aprons. But anyway, back to Chicago. This was a Boy Scout troop that felt that they liked to march in formation to their garden because it prepared them for when they were going to be drafted. Go to the next one. Here's some young ladies who are ready to garden for victory. They're a little more cheerful than the would-be soldiers in the previous picture. Let's go to the next one. So this is a Chicago Park District photo. This is one of the many successful victory garden projects conducted through Chicago Public Schools. And this one was in charge by a woman named Miss Flersham, principal of the Brennan School. A nearby vacant lot was turned into a very fine vegetable and flower growing plot. A special ceremony and party was held the day the garden was started and plots were assigned. Right through the summer, including the hot vacation period, these youngsters continued their cultivation and insect control. Because of Miss Flersham's excellent leadership, fine crops of vegetables resulted. So this was the photo that showed in the newspaper. Let's go ahead and advance. Here's the other photo that didn't show. I think this really illustrates, what people working with children go through. This guy in the front, I know he got busted for something. I like to joke that maybe he had sugar high, but since sugar was ration, maybe it was molasses high. I'm not so sure. But if you just sort of look at that pandemonium of what those teachers had to put up with to make something like this happen, I really like that photo. Let's go to the next one. So of course, they all had to report up to the OCD. I don't know if you can see this, but these were their report cards, which show their plot number, their row number, gardener's name and address, have the weeds been removed, have the insects or disease been taken care of, et cetera, et cetera. And all this information was collected and tallied on up through the ranks. So the kids were not immune to the OCD of the OCD. So let's go ahead. So the harvest. We were leading the nation in 1942. We had 12,000 family gardens on 509 community plots, 290 acres. And in 1943, 53,000 family gardens on 59 community plots, 14,000 children's gardens, and all this on 908 acres. Now, this is just community gardens. This doesn't include people that have home gardens or people that weren't joiners that didn't want to fill out the form to get the sticker. This is just the information that we have. And a lot happened in the suburbs, but I'm not talking about that. So how did Chicago do it? Let's go to the next slide. Let's just reiterate this. We had government support. There were overarching organizational structures. There's a donation of space and equipment. There's mass education, promotion, corporate and individual commitment, and recognition. So let's go on now to today. We talked about 1942, 1943. People often ask, well, did the victory gardens just end at the end of the war? I'm like, well, technically they did end. They stopped being called victory gardens, but people continued to garden. And immediately after the war ended, they became freedom gardens because the Cold War was starting to percolate. So you'd see information like food fights the Red Menace. It was still a disaster over in Europe, so people had to get food, and whoever was giving them food probably was the side they were swinging toward. If it was Soviet Union or Russia, they could potentially become part of the Cold War Soviet Union. It was America, so food was a real tug of war in Europe. After that, and around the late 40s, early 50s, after the GI started coming back, inflation started happening. So the gardens were called thrift gardens. People continued gardening to save money. After that, around the mid-50s, people were real tired of gardening. The world was changing. We were becoming the American dream. We were moving to the suburbs, getting big cars, and they wanted to keep up with the Joneses in different ways. So that was sort of the end, of the names to the Victory Garden movement. Of course, people continued gardening through that, but from a movement perspective, really sort of moved on to landscape gardening, and my house being better looking than my neighbor's house. My roses are better, my clematis is better, whatever that is. So let's talk about today. Go ahead, thank you. We have a new motivation for victory gardening. We don't have a universal effort, toward defeating an enemy, but we all have our own little individual enemies, our we're fighting against, and they're all valid. It could be the economy, you need to save money, it could be transportation costs, your carbon footprint, food safety, other environmental concerns, GMOs, GE, loss of seed diversity, self-sufficiency, and if you've grown your food, you know that homegrown food tastes better and better. Let's go on. It's a little preaching to the choir with this audience, but you know that the first administration since World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt, to have a food garden at the White House. It took a long time to get that food garden there. Just a little aside, the USDA did not want Eleanor Roosevelt to have a food garden at the White House. Did not want her to have a victory garden. They were worried that the precious resources, those precious seeds, would be squandered by those city slickers trying to grow their own food and failing because of what happened during World War I. After the first season, and cities like Chicago did such a good job, the USDA was more into it. I found only one photo of Eleanor Roosevelt's victory garden, and she wasn't even tending it. It was the vice president, like some photo op of him and his little girl. So it was interesting that the USDA wasn't interested, which leads me to my next point. You can all collectively boo Tom Vilsack if you want, but one thing that he has done that's interesting, Tom Vilsack is the USDA Secretary of Agriculture. One of his first mandates when he got his position was to start the People's Garden Program. So the USDA is considered the People's Department, started by Abraham Lincoln on the anniversary of his birth. He put out this, Vilsack put out this memorandum to all the USDA facilities across the world, there's 30,000 of them, that they should start a garden or they should participate in a garden. So now every state, every province has a People's Garden. There's all over Europe, and they've given almost 1 million pounds of produce to local food banks. So kind of interesting. I point this out because I feel like it's the first time we've had the political environment to make a movement like this, a victory garden concerted effort in cities to have these huge food gardens happen. Let's also talk a little bit about communities today. People lament that nobody goes to church anymore, or there aren't social organizations. People are more, they don't go outside because they have air conditioning, whatever those things that we don't have now that we think people had back then. Like we're missing something. But I like to point out that people are forming communities in new ways today, and they want to be together, but they're also using social media in a lot of ways. So if we could go to this next one. If you study statistics about how people learn how to garden, the number one statistic forever and all time is from a neighbor or a friend. It's the best way. The number two statistic is until 2009 been books. In 2009 it became the internet. So your friends are your first option, or your neighbors, and your second option is the web. So I show you this because it kind of combines the best of both worlds. This book was written using social media. The authors reached out to people that had never gardened before, asked them how they'd like to learn, what they'd like to learn, wrote this book using different private groups on Facebook and being in different social networks. Wrote the book in 90 days and published it. It's a very good gardening book, very basic gardening book, good stuff. But the difference is, if you have a question on page 72 about the asparagus pea, you can send them a tweet, you can send them an email, you can go to their Facebook page. So you still are able to have that community relationship with people, despite the fact that you're reading the book.
What's the name of the book?
It's called Grocery Gardening. It's by Jean Ann Van Crevelen. So let's go to the next slide. This is a garden at 77th and the Lake. This is Rainbow Beach. It's a community garden that was an original World War II victory garden. The one existing community garden in Chicago that has lived its whole life from World War II till today. I heard when I was speaking a couple weeks ago that there are 3 gardens in Evanston that have continued to be gardens since World War II, which is fascinating. A little funny story about this garden, it's on the bus line. The Park District doesn't like fencing gardens because they want their property to be available to everybody, right? That's what the Park District is all about. Well, this garden was on the bus line, and the bus driver would stop in front of the garden and let people go to the garden and pick food that weren't gardeners, and then get back on the bus and drive off. So the Park District agreed that maybe in these circumstances it would be okay to have a fence and the lock on the gate so the gardeners didn't grow all their food for the people of us. There's another, go ahead. I showed you this photo earlier. So I've been doing all this research and kind of got excited about the idea of victory gardens and what sort of impact it could have today. And they seem to do a really good job during World War II. They had this nice plan. So I thought, what would it be like if we just followed those steps and just recreating victory gardens. So I showed you this before, go ahead. That photo on the far side, circled in my neighborhood, that was an empty lot. Everything else had been built up, but that one piece was an empty lot. So I was driving down, and it actually isn't today because this was 3 years ago. I was driving down Peterson with my husband. We've been studying all this. I've been talking to my parents about it. You know, we had just bought our house a few years earlier, and like, that's a lot from the picture. He's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, the lot from the picture, the lot from the picture. I said, you're gonna kill us, right? We're driving. You know, I just had my epiphany, like, that's a lot from the picture. What, you know, maybe we should try and put in another victory garden. So I went to my alderman and I said, hey, did you know that this was a victory garden? I'm a master gardener. Why don't we, you know, I've been studying World War II. Why don't we try and put a victory garden in? And he said, go for it. So we got a lot of support. So here was my game plan, right? Go ahead. Government support, donations to space and equipment, overarching organizational structure, mass education, corporate and individual commitment, and recognition. Not reinventing the wheel, just doing exactly what they did during World War II. So what happened, go ahead, is we were trying to repeat history repeating itself, or as I like to say, history repeating itself. So we started the Peterson Garden Project. Go ahead. This was our plan. You know, as I mentioned, I'm a master gardener. I've been a food gardener all my life, and so I tried to think through, okay, we want to invite people that have never gardened before. We want to keep it as simple as possible. We want to remove as much complexity as possible so people can go in here and really succeed. So that's how we designed the garden, and I'll get to that a little bit more in the few minutes. You know, so then I was the blog captain. I'm going to go to the next slide. You know, one of the blog captain's duties is morale boosting. So this was us at the groundbreaking. I'm making everybody do a sing-along. I'm not going to make you do a sing-along today, so don't worry. That's me doing the sing-along. That's our alderman laughing at me. Go ahead. So we used social media to launch this garden. We launched it in April 27th of 2010, and within 5 days, we had 50 people in the community that were meeting at a restaurant to talk about this garden. I thought, you know, if 20 people wanted to do it, it would be fun. And it ended up, between those people and the people that joined after that, becoming the largest edible garden in the city at that time. Anyway, we used Twitter too. Go ahead. We used Twitter. And go ahead, there's one more. These were some of the people that started with us at that first spot. Go ahead. And we had to educate people, right? 90% of the victory gardeners in World War II didn't know how to grow their food, so we invited people that had never grown their food before. We did it very simply. You know, all of our beds are raised beds. Now, I'm not advocating one way or another. There's a million ways to garden, and if your food's growing, you're doing it right. But we did it specifically using square foot gardening techniques. And there's a tool on Gardener Supply called the Kitchen Garden Planner. So we had homework for people. What do you want to eat? Here's the size of the beds. Go to this website, pick what you want to eat. It's a drag and drop tool where you can, you know, grab, you know, peppers. It'll show you how many per square, and then people would bring their homework, and we would teach them from there. So let's go to this next slide. This is actually a little video, and I will talk through. Someone always asks, what kind of soil did you use? Where did you get the water? So I'll answer some of those questions during this video. This is a time lapse of when we put the garden in 2010. I also would like to point out, like 1943, it was an incredibly wet, rainy spring. So every time I planned a volunteer activity, it got rained out. But this was the beds. We put in 157 raised beds. It had been a foundation, you know, so there was a building, but it was gone. So there was no topsoil. I personally like raised bed gardening for many reasons that if you want to know what those are, we can talk afterwards. But we put down 250 cubic yards of mulch, which is a lot. We built the beds. You can see how they're lining them all out now. We put weed barrier in the bottom. And then we got 110 cubic yards of mushroom compost, organic garden mix. We do all organic gardening. We teach everybody organic gardening. And so then people became members of the Peterson Garden Project. They paid a small fee, and then they got assigned their bed. So then here you see the individuals starting to put in the soil. So everybody had to shovel their own soil. And then if you look, you'll start to notice how some of the square foot markings start to develop. So you can see that those are some of the new gardeners. And this was a space of about 5 days. We condensed it down into this little 3-minute thing. We had some rain in there, but once we got the, so there you can see the square foot gardening. Once we got the beds put in, it went pretty fast. It was a little bit of a hair pulling exercise, getting things delivered. Our gate never seemed to be enough for the dump trucks coming in, so we have to take the fence down, put the fence up, and if the guy didn't show up when he said, then, it was a lot of drama at first. Sure learned a lot though that first year. So you can see, here's a little bit later where people's crops are starting to grow a little bit. That's what that garden ended up looking like at the end of the season. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So, sometimes you stumble into really wonderful things unsuspecting. I never really thought anything more than to satisfy my own curiosity. What if we did this? But we learned, there's a famous permaculturalist that said all the problems of the world can be solved in the garden. We learned that very quickly in this garden. People were there for a lot of reasons. And mostly it was for the community. So the food growing was a good thing, but the community that formed out of it was a big deal. So we thought, this worked pretty good. We've done it before, but what could we do to do more of this? Share this model, make this happen. So we decided that we needed to be a not-for-profit, and we decided that we had a model, and that was to recruit, educate, and inspire a new generation dedicated to making urban food production more not the exception. So the next phase, that was 2010, 2011, we started getting very serious about doing this in a bigger scale. So we spent a lot of time in 2011. We had a lot of interest from the press. We had a lot of visits. A lot of people really liked how the model